Hey folks, Dust here, and I wanted to discuss the playoffs, otherwise known as the champion stage of the IEM Katowice 2019 major, just following in line with all of the content I've been doing around this major. I won't be doing the in-game pick'em this time around, just because the way it's structured, to pick all the games at once, so obviously if I fuck up a quarterfinals match, then it kind of messes up the whole bracket, so it's kind of hard to use that. So it's back to the good old days of just staring at my face the whole time while I talk through these games. And I'm going to split this up into two parts. This first part will look at the games that are taking place the first day of the quarterfinals, which is, of course, Navi versus FaZe, and then Liquid versus ENCE, and then I'll do the other two matchups in the second part. Also, to try to help keep this from being too long of a video, other than just splitting up into parts, I might not go into detail on some topics because I do have some other content on this channel that relates to some of these teams. So I'll put those links in the description below, or you can just kind of look back on the channel and find those videos if you want to, and I'll try to direct you in that area if indeed there is some other content that I think you might enjoy that goes into a little bit more depth on some of these teams. But without further ado, let's start things off by talking about FaZe versus Navi. And so what I'm going to do with these matches, I'm going to talk about each team a little bit first, then talk about the head-to-head history a little bit and just kind of the thoughts about the matchup, talk a little bit about the map pick ban and how that might go. And then I'll, of course, give you a little bit of a prediction on who I think will ultimately win and advance through the bracket. So starting off with FaZe, again, I've talked about them in some other content already. Particularly, I did some takeaways from the E-League Invitational where I talked about FaZe in pretty good detail, so I'll definitely link that in the description below if you want, my thoughts on this team at a deeper level than what you're going to get in this video. But, I mean, essentially, this team, did a couple of warm-up events after bringing in Yanko and Adren at the IEM Power Masters and at the E-League Invitational. Obviously, IEM Power Masters did not go well at all. They go out in the group stage to Ghost and back-to-back losses to them on Train, I believe it was, that got them eliminated from that. But then they went to the E-League Invitational, and they actually did wind up winning, despite losing their opening series to Cloud9. They came back, beating Complexity and Big, and then facing Cloud9 in a rematch in the finals and winning that. And then they went into a boot camp for, I believe, a couple of weeks to prepare for the major. And in the Legend stage, they struggled quite a bit. You could already see some signs of issues whenever we were watching them play at the E-League Invitational, despite the fact that they won. And you've really kind of still seen those lingering around, despite the fact that they've had a bit more time together, the boot camp and things of that nature. Because in the Legend stage, they went 3-2. They won their opening game against Hellraisers on Train. Pretty good game. They look pretty strong here. Definitely not a bad debut. Then they wound up losing a game to Renegades on Inferno. They looked really lost in that game, particularly on their terrorist side. They wound up also losing a game to Avangard on Mirage, so they had to battle back through best of threes. And they eventually did get here, though, obviously. They beat Complexity first. Actually dropped the map to them, though. Cash game. They lost that one real bad. And then against Cloud9, they 2-0'd them, but they looked really rough on Cash. Almost threw away a massive lead, but definitely looked a little bit stronger on Dust too. And so they do find themselves, of course, in this matchup. And I mean, FaZe has a lot to live up to, in this playoffs. I mean, they're a team that has always been prided on their individual talent. And, they really did have some high marks to end last year. Obviously, that whole situation with Kerrigan kind of being removed from the in-game leader slot and eventually moved from the team altogether. But this is a team that was always still capable of good things, even when things started looking a little bit rough. Obviously, looking really good at things like, IEM Chicago, where they beat Strauss and made Brazil, and only wound up losing a Team Liquid in the semifinals, or how they won Epicenter. But definitely had their issues at other events, like ESO1, New York, of course, where there was a really disappointing finish there, and then obviously Blast Lisbon, where they didn't win a single map. So this team, we always kind of talk about how if they're on form, if their stars are shining, if, everyone's firing on all cylinders, this team is so dangerous just because of the individual firepower that they pack. But the problem is that you're not always getting those big performances anymore out of these players. Like Guardian can be a little bit of a mixed bag with how good his form is. You can have a game like he did against Cloud9 on Train at the E-League Invitational Finals, but then you can have other games where he definitely goes a lot more quiet. Certainly Nico is particularly always playing the way you want. But, Rain can sometimes have his struggles too. I mean, he had some good games against Cloud9, but looked a bit off versus Complexity and Avangard in this major. Guardian was mostly fine, but nothing monstrous, really, and he did struggle a bit versus Cloud9. Olaf had an off series against Complexity, but played okay, versus Cloud9, and overall fine for the role that he plays. And I would say Adren actually has been really solid so far. This is probably his best event so far since being on FaZe. Had a couple of maps where he was a little bit off, but he hasn't truly had a poor game. He's actually looked quite good through most of the games. So, yeah, you got to think about just the individual performances of the team. Are they going to be there or not? It's always the question anytime you're predicting a match that FaZe is involved in. one of the biggest issues I'm seeing with FaZe is one, I'm not really sure what their map pool is yet with this team, just because, obviously they're a team that can play a map like Mirage. Their playstyle really suits a map like Mirage, but I have seen them drop it a couple of times, like losing to Avangard in this major, for instance. Their Train and their Dust 2 seem to be some of the more dangerous maps that they've played. But, a map like Cash, I've seen them really struggle on, despite the fact historically that was a map they were quite comfortable on. So, again, their map pool is something that I'm still not really certain about. The other big thing that I'm noticing is that despite the fact that they have a lot of powerful individuals, and some of them are performing pretty well, like Nico is probably the most consistent player who seems to be having good impact almost every game. And then again, I've already talked about some of the other players. They do really lack cohesion on the Terra side of almost every map. I mean, I think their Train and their Dust 2 look pretty good, but some of their T sides on, like Cash and Inferno, and even sometimes on Mirage, they can seem to get just really lost. Someone will go for the play on their own and they'll die, and there's no one there to really trade. Like the spacing's just off. They're not really playing together as a unit. For instance, there was a couple of times on Cash where like Nico and a couple of guys would be working the B side of Cash, and they'd still have a guy Squeaky Door Hall and a guy still kind of just playing outside A main or something like that. And then no matter what happens with that attack on B, those other two guys are just nowhere to have any impact or be able to really do anything. They're not even aggressively lurking and creating pressure. They're just kind of sitting back and watching, and maybe to try to catch a rotation or make sure that they're not getting backstabbed. But you can just tell that there's a lack of really working together as a unit, and people going for plays, individually without really anybody there to trade. So there's a lot of times where the play works, then great, you can make something happen. But if that person dies, then you're just in a 4-on-5 because there's no potential for anyone to be able to, use that death to get something back against their opponent. And in general, sometimes they can just get lost in kind of mid-round situations. In all the chaos, sometimes just things seem to really go awry. And yeah, for the amount of talent they have, their T-sides are definitely really troubling to me. And that's one of the big things to think about going into this after what we saw in the Legend stage from them. And so now I'll talk a little bit about Navi. So despite all the issues that Navi have had and all that drama with like the Zeus interview before the major, and obviously having a really tough time at the GG Bet Ice Challenge, which is kind of their tune-up event right before the major, where they lost to North in the finals and also lost to Heroic early in the tournament, so definitely a very disappointing event. On average, this team is still usually quite good. They were one of the teams that had one of the deeper map pools last year outside of like an Astralis or Liquid, maybe ENCE, and a couple other teams that are still in these playoffs. This is a team that had a pretty good map pool, had a pretty strong 2018 overall. Again, they certainly had, their mishaps. IEM Chicago and ESO New York were certainly big examples, but they played really well at an event like Blast Copenhagen, where, of course, they beat NIP in the finals. They definitely had a couple of other good events as well, like at EPL Season 7, some of the DreamHack Masters events they attended, some of the Starlighter events they attended, obviously second at the Face It Major only to Astralis. So definitely a team that is still really strong. But I mean, the biggest thing is obviously they're really heavily reliant on players like Simple and Electronic to be able to get them where they need to be to get results. Obviously Flemmy can sometimes be a really solid third player for them, but he certainly can have his moments where he goes missing. Edward is definitely not really that reliable. I mean, he'll have a couple events in a row where he does good, but then he'll have a streak of several events where he doesn't do so hot. And obviously you can't really count on Zeus for fragging either. So when you compare them to other elite level teams like an Astralis, like a Liquid, like a FaZe, when their players are on form, they really on average don't have as much firepower as some of these other teams kind of ranked amongst the top 5. And it definitely can come back to haunt them in that regard. Regardless, though, they still are certainly a top 3 team in the world, I think, just behind Liquid, who's kind of seen as number 2 right now. And so you definitely have to still have faith in them to be able to deliver you something, especially just with the talent that Simple and Electronic bring to the table alone. And so far this major, they did all right in the Legend stage. I mean, they went 3-1. Their only loss was a loss to Team Liquid in a best-of-3, who is the team that has a massive head-to-head advantage against Navi. I don't think Navi's ever beaten Liquid. Obviously, they've only played them once with the Stewie lineup, but even the Taco lineup, they were never able to beat that team. They lost all 6 maps they played against Liquid offline. They lost, obviously, these 2 maps here, so they've lost all 8 of the last 8 times they played Liquid offline. But they were able to beat G2, Vitality, and Avangard. Granted, that isn't the stiffest competition they faced to advance to the playoffs when you think of some of the other teams in the field. The one time they did face an elite level team, they lost at 0-2. But still, they got the job done, and they are here. Simple is on a tear per usual. I think Flamey's actually been pretty solid so far in most games. I think that Edward is a bit of a mixed bag, but I think that's kind of to be expected. I think Electronic hasn't really hit a stride yet compared to his potential. I think he's been okay, but I don't think he's really hit that monster level just yet. And if he can, then that is obviously going to be what gives the team that extra little edge they need to perhaps actually make a deep run at these playoffs. Again, I still think that they pack a pretty decent map pool. They obviously pack a lot of individual talent. And, even though they aren't as tactical as a Liquid or an Astralis or, some of these other teams that are in these playoffs, I think that they still are good enough, especially going up against a team like FaZe, who is struggling with some of their T-side cohesion. I think Na'Vi at least has many of the basics down, and while their utility usage isn't as good as maybe some other teams, while at times they don't have the players, the talent to be able to do the efficient trading and stuff like that in kind of early to mid-round situations, I think that they, again, at least have somewhat of a playbook. They have default roles. They have been able to at least get Electronic more involved, not just always a peripheral player, but on certain maps they get him more active in early to mid-round situations, and even on maps where he might play the edge of the map, he can be very active in that role. So I feel like they've given Electronic the room he's needed to have more impact on T-sides. Obviously, Simple, how big of a playmaker he can be. And then again, if Flamey's feeling it, man, he still definitely can add a lot of value to the team. They do have some faster pace executes. They can play more explosive. They're not just, stuck playing that old slow default style that Zeus is, known for throughout his early years in CSGO. And while, Zeus isn't some super mastermind just innovating the game, coming with all this crazy new stuff and really blowing your mind with these crazy elaborate executes or something like that, again, the basics are still there. They do have some complex executes, and at least they have somewhat of a foundation, which in comparison to a FaZe, I feel like they're not nearly as settled in as a team like Na'Vi is with how they want to use their players and how they want to approach the game. Talking about the head-to-head between these two teams, they traded maps between Blast Lisbon and Blast Copenhagen when it comes to best of ones. They also exchanged best of threes against one another at Epicenter. After that, we did have Na'Vi beating FaZe at the FaceIt Major to best of one and also beat FaZe 2-0 at the EPL Season 7 Finals, but this is way back in May of 2018. And then if you go further back on head-to-head history, again, it goes way earlier into the year where lineups are different, at least for FaZe. So the head-to-head between these two teams is actually pretty close historically, but again, the lineup is obviously going to be different for FaZe, not only a player change, but a new endgame leader and a new coach. So a lot has changed. I think this is one of the harder matchups to predict in the quarterfinals. Obviously, no spoilers, but, Astralis and Liquid are certainly heavy favorites to make a run all the way to the finals. But I think this matchup and maybe the Made in Brazil Renegades match are some of the more interesting ones that are a little bit harder to call. I think when it comes to the veto, in the last few best of threes, Na'Vi has stuck to just banning Cash, and FaZe has pretty much stuck to just banning Nuke. I don't really see why this would change. For picks, I think FaZe has picked Mirage and Overpass in the past against Na'Vi, whereas Na'Vi have historically gone for either Train or Dust 2 as their first pick. Na'Vi did take Nuke the one time FaZe left it on the table, and they wound up winning it. So that could be further evidence that FaZe would be swayed away from getting away from a Nuke ban, just kind of sticking with it. But again, this FaZe team with Adren and with, Yanko as a coach and Nico calling have not played that much, so I'm not sure what they might have cooked up in their boot camp to maybe be a curveball. With that in mind, I have seen at Na'Vi second ban Inferno in the past whenever it's gone around that rotation. And I've usually seen FaZe remove Train or Dust 2. But now I feel like maps like Train and Dust 2 are some of the maps where FaZe look the most cohesive. And so I don't know that they would second ban a map like a Train or a Dust 2 as they have done historically. When I think about who's actually going to win this game, I think that the firepower that Simple brings to the table is more than that of any other player on the server other than maybe Nico. I think those two can definitely go head-to-head. And then at that point, it just comes down to who are you banking on being the supporting cast? Like, are you banking on Electronic and Flamey being able to bring a lot to the table and really support Simple? Or on the flip side, are you banking on a guy like Rain, a guy like Guardian to be the really impactful players to be that supporting cast against Nico? So obviously, when it comes to the individual fireworks, it just really depends on who's going to be on form. That's what makes this game so hard to call. The problem is I think that Navi's map pool is a little bit more proven than FaZe's just because we have more of a sample size to look at. And again, I think coming out of last year, Navi did have one of the deeper map pools in the game, despite whatever issues they might have. They at least were capable of putting together a default in at least a basic level playbook on many more maps than what FaZe were able to do. And again, I think even if Zeus is not some super genius or is, innovating or doing anything super crazy, I think at the very least he has his team a lot more well-grounded on their T-side defaults and some of their executes than FaZe, who look a lot less cohesive. Neither one of these teams are blowing my mind strategically, but again, I think I do have to give Na'Vi the slight nod just because they do look a little bit sharper, a little bit more on the same page. with all of that in mind, again, I think this game is actually very difficult to call because of the individuals involved and thinking about the head-to-head history and how well these teams know each other and how they performed against each other in the past. But I got to give the slight nod to Na'Vi, if nothing else, just because I feel like Na'Vi looked a little bit more convincing so far this major, whereas FaZe really, after the E-League Invitational and iBuyPower Masters, where I was a bit worried about their T sides, and basically all of 2018 when I was worried about their T sides, they've come back with this boot camp and are still scaring me on some of their T sides, particularly on maps like Cash and Inferno, which I think a map like Inferno could certainly get played in this series. So this is basically just a long way of me saying that I think Na'Vi will win this series. And with that, we will move on to Liquid versus ENCE. So with Liquid, there's obviously not too much to talk about with their current 5 because they've only played one event since 2E2K joined the team, and of course that is the iBuyPower Masters event where they were able to get through the groups against Luminosity and Ghost, no real problems. They were able to beat Fnatic in the semifinals, which obviously Fnatic was a colossal flop at the major, but heading into the major, they had actually done pretty well at events like IEM Chicago and PLG Grand Slam, so this was actually a pretty legit best-of-3 win for Team Liquid in the semis. And then they finally got the monkey off their back by beating Astralis in the finals. And while obviously there's going to be a little bit of an asterisk next to it because of the conditions of the tournament, I think you still can't take too much away from Liquid beating Astralis. I think both these teams were competing under the same conditions. They both obviously wanted to win. So with that, I don't think you should really be able to take anything away from Team Liquid's victory here. But certainly what you can't do is overemphasize the win, because obviously there are a mountain of wins Astralis have over Team Liquid going back into last year. I mean, Liquid could never beat Astralis last year. I think it was like 24 maps to Astralis and 4 maps to Liquid out of 28 maps played against each other, and Liquid had never won a series against Astralis. So one win doesn't change the mountain of a head-to-head advantage that Astralis has. What it might do, though, is maybe alleviate the mental block that Liquid had if they face Astralis again. But that's obviously for a later date. But yeah, Liquid obviously a very successful team with their older lineup with Taco. I mean, they went to 14 LAN events last year and made 7 finals, but they only won 1 title. That was the big thing that irked Liquid, and the bulk of it was because of Astralis, obviously. However, there were a couple of exceptions, like Mouse Sports, of course, beating them in the finals of ESL1 New York. That was like their big chance to get a Tier 1 title, not having to play against Astralis. So definitely had a few disappointments last year, but overall, we're a team that only placed outside of the top 4 on 4 occasions out of 14 events, so still usually making deep runs in all tournaments. Again, outside of the Astralis matchup, they were doing quite well. FaZe was the only other team outside of Astralis that had the head-to-head record against Liquid, unless you count the North lineup from DreamHack Masters Stockholm, which is kind of fluky. But outside of that, it was really just Astralis and FaZe again in the most trouble. They were able to go to the toilet Mouse Sports and beat them more often than not. If you take out the New York final, Liquid had an advantage over Mouse Sports. They obviously had a massive head-to-head advantage over Na'Vi. They beat Energy more often than not. They always beat Made in Brazil. They were able to beat Big on most occasions, same with Hellraisers and same with Fnatic. So definitely a really good team, and individually had some really good players. Players like Naf, like Twist, like Alish, all ranked in the HLTV top 20. Nitro was not too far outside of that. By the way, I think he was definitely somewhere between 20 and 25 in the rankings, so definitely pretty good individual players. Again, we already talked about this, very strategical, really good at playing explosively, really good at playing slower defaults when need be. Nitro was a functional opper, but also doubled as a great entry rifler. Riflers like Twist and Naf were super flexible, and it was just kind of on a map-by-map basis on who took initiative and who was the featured player, so to speak, but extremely successful, a really good team. The best NA lineup we've ever seen in CSGO, the one with Taco, of course, and Stewie's looking to add to this team and make them even better than they were with Taco, perhaps, and certainly iBuyPower Masters was a pretty good look in that direction. And here at the Legend stage of this major, they went 3-0. They beat Avangard, they beat NIP, and they 2-0'd Na'Vi. So they played against a couple of the better teams in the Legend stage, particularly being able to play Na'Vi. So pretty strong wins there. I think what I've seen so far from Liquid with Stewie between iBuyPower Masters and this major is they've balanced the implementation of Stewie quite well. Like, there's some maps where he just takes Taco's spot, like Suki on Cash, for instance, and he thrives on that spot, and it's actually fine. But then there's some other maps where maybe Twist has taken a spot to make sure that Stewie can kind of be a part of the mid-attacking group. Same can be said for, someone like Naf on Overpass, who's back lurking outside the B-bomb site again. So they've done a good job on some maps shifting people's roles to get Stewie more comfortable, and in other situations just letting Stewie kind of take over Taco spots. One thing that might be slightly concerning is they have been a bit slower paced than I'm used to. It's not that they didn't play slow before, but I felt like they were a little bit more explosive, a little bit more willing to take duels with the older lineup than they are now. I feel like they've been a little bit timid, which actually timidness was something that kind of haunted them, particularly on CT sides in certain games like the Mouse Sports New York final. So that got me a little bit worried. But Adren did address this in an interview and did say that it was something they were going to focus on the rest of the tournament to try to get out of that trap of playing a little bit too slow sometimes and just kind of being hesitant and kind of pausing and waiting for an opponent to give them something or to make a mistake, that he wanted to be a little bit more proactive. And you did see them throughout the tournament kind of crank it up a little bit. So that's something to maybe keep your eye on. But overall, I think Liquid's a team that's very versatile on what styles of Counter-Strike that they can play. They definitely have some things they're more known for, but again, they're a pretty well-balanced team. Individually, everyone is playing really, really well. Everyone's been mostly fine. I think everyone's pretty much where you would like them to be, including Stewie, who is performing much better individually with Liquid than he was through some of his times with Made in Brazil. And like I said, generally speaking, they've all looked good. I mean, we've even seen Nitro have a couple of fucking monster games, and then the key players on this team have certainly been up to snuff so far. And again, I've talked a lot more about Liquid and other content, so I'll link that below if you want more detailed analysis of Team Liquid. Now I'll talk about ENCE. Obviously, coming into this event, ENCE had done well at a slew of different Tier 2 events like DreamHack Opens and Star Ladder and things of that nature. Even won a DreamHack winner, won Star Ladder Season 6, won this most recent European minor. Always doing well against kind of Tier 2, Tier 3 opposition, and at times being able to slug it with the big boys. I mean, they had that cool top 8 finish at ESL1 Cologne, for instance, where they narrowly lost to Navi in the last match of the group stage, but had some BO3 wins over NIP and Mouse Sports. Coming into the event, they definitely had shown that they had a lot of firepower. I mean, Sergey is hella legit in most of the play that he's had with ENCE. Alu obviously has been an absolute monster on this team. And, you know, guys like Aaron Alexa B could definitely still contribute really well fragging-wise. And Alexa B is not bad at the in-game leading slot at all. He's actually done a pretty good job leading this team. Much more of an explosive team, like to play more fast-paced Counter-Strike than anything else. But at least it's structured. At least the spacing is good. At least they're on the same page. And they have shown some neat little executes here and there that are a little bit more complex. And they can slow it down and play default and just work picks when they need to. They also have one of the deepest map pools in this tournament. I think that's one of the things that they don't get enough credit for. I mean, everyone kind of knows how good Sergey is and how good Alu is and how explosive they can be, but I think people forget just how deep this team's map pool is. They have several different maps they can perform on, like Dust 2, like Inferno, like Train, solid win rates on Nuke and Mirage as well. They've been okay on Cash. The few LAN games I've seen, even really the only weaker thing they have is, I guess, still Cash and then obviously Overpass map that they typically ban. And they have done pretty well so far this major. I mean, they did fine enough in the challenger stage. Nothing really to harp on there. I mean, they won the best of ones in their opening 2 games. They did lose the one best of 3 Renegades, but then were able to beat Windstrike and get out 3-1, so not bad. Legend stage, though, this one was a little bit more dicey, right? I mean, they lost their opening game to Renegades in a close fashion on Inferno. They then also lost to Hellraisers on Dust 2, which is actually ENCE's best map, or one of their best maps, I would say. And yeah, this looked really bad, but then they battled back, beating Big, beating G2, and beating Avangar, 2-0 on G2 and Avangar, and making it here to the playoffs. One thing I have noticed, though, with ENCE that has worried me a little bit, because generally speaking, when I've watched some of the games, they still look pretty sharp in their tactics, and they're getting pretty good performances out of the people you would want. The one person that has really gone missing, though, is Sergey. This might be one of the worst events I've seen Sergey play for ENCE, and I'm a little bit concerned because you need Sergey. Like, yeah, Alu has been great on the op. Yes, guys like Ariel and Alexa B can be quite good in some of their entry rifling positions, and, you know, have often been the supporting cast of guys like Alu and Sergey as far as being that added firepower. But man, they need Sergey, especially against Liquid. With as much firepower as Liquid has, if Sergey goes missing and it's up to just Alexa B, Alu, and, you know, Ariel, and in between Ariel and Alexa B, none of them are really truly consistent stars like Sergey has been for ENCE, you're in a lot of trouble because, I mean, Liquid has 5 really heavy hitters, and they're all performing pretty well so far this major, and they all perform pretty well out by Power Masters. And I mean, Elige, Naf, and Twist did it all 2018. So that is a big concern for me with ENCE, is if Sergey can step it up, because he's definitely had a lot of off games, particularly in the legend stage of this event. There is no head-to-head history between Liquid and ENCE, so we'll just skip that part. There's really nothing there to go back to, and we'll just kind of look at the veto, how I think things will go. So I think ENCE should just ban Cash. This is one of their weakest maps. I think it's either going to be Cash or an Overpass ban from ENCE. Typically, they've been more leaning towards banning Cash. And this is obviously a historically excellent map for Team Liquid. They've loved playing Cash. That was probably their best map throughout 2018. They just didn't get to play it that much because most of the time it got removed. But when it was on the table, I think Liquid was the best Cash team in the world. I think that they probably still will be quite good against 2E2K. Against 2E2K just kind of takes over Taco's spots, and he feels comfortable in those spots. So I think that certainly Cash has to be a map that we will see ENCE remove. Again, they could maybe ban Overpass, but I think it's going to be Cash. I think Team Liquid should ban Train. ENCE are really dangerous on Train. That is statistically their best map land-wise. So I think that they should probably really look to avoid Train. They might also avoid Nuke, but I know the core of Liquid historically is actually quite good on Nuke outside of the Astralis matchup. So if they've put in some prep and they feel comfortable enough, I think they could leave Nuke alone and leave it in and look to ban Train. That is personally what I would think would be the right choice. I think ENCE will take whatever is left between Train or Nuke, to be honest. I know that ENCE do have some comfort in Inferno and Dust 2, but those are maps that Liquid can certainly play. And so I think that if you want to go for a Liquid weakness, or at least a map that Liquid isn't as strong on, then I think a map like Train or Nuke would probably be their best bet to get kind of a guaranteed map in the series. I think for Team Liquid, I think they should take whatever's left between Cash and Overpass. I think they have really vamped up their Overpass from what I've seen out of them in these tournaments they've played so far. I mean, they look really good on Overpass against NIP, or at least good enough to get the win. Same with Avangar. They also were able to beat Astralis in Overpass. They have a Power Masters Grand Final. So if somehow ENCE leaves Overpass on the table, because they're going to ban Cash probably, I think Liquid should definitely just look to attack that and should feel pretty comfortable there, because I think that outside of Cash, this is one of ENCE's weaker maps. But obviously, Liquid could also maybe go for comfort on something like an Inferno or a Dust 2. I think, though, that if you pick into those maps, you're kind of picking some maps that ENCE would rather play, and so you're not taking as much advantage as you could, but you never really know. Other than that, I think maps like Inferno, Mirage, and Dust 2 could get played either as a third map or maybe a surprise pick, but again, I think ENCE should feel comfortable picking into a map like Nuke if it's there, or Train, and then Liquid should feel pretty confident picking into a map like Overpass. With that in mind, because Liquid has just been so strong throughout 2018 with this core lineup and have typically done well against teams ranked below them. Again, it was really only Astralis and FaZe that gave them a lot of trouble. I think FaZe is the only team that was ranked below them that constantly gave them trouble. You know, I have to give Liquid the nod here. I think that they are the favorite. I think that their talent has performed more consistently throughout this major. Again, I think Sergey's really gone missing so far this major. I think Liquid has more overall firepower than ENCE, even if someone like Sergey can go toe-to-toe with anyone on Liquid if he's in form, and Alu can be a fantastic opper, something where obviously it's a little bit more of an op by committee situation on Team Liquid, depending on the map and the side. You know, I think ENCE can certainly go toe-to-toe with them. They are very dangerous. But again, if Sergey is going to show up to this game like he has so far this major and been a bit more quiet, and you have everyone in Liquid performing really well, I think that Liquid is going to win the firepower game. I think that there are some holes in ENCE's map pool that Liquid can exploit, and they do share some common ground. This is to come down to who plays stronger. I do think that Liquid is a little bit better tactically than ENCE. I think ENCE is pretty good tactically, but I think Liquid's a little bit deeper, a little bit more versatile, particularly with the roles when their players can play. And I think that Liquid's just the more seasoned team. So when you think about the experience, when you think about the overall talent, you think about how well they've been performing so far this major, when it all shakes down, I think you have to pick Liquid here. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Again, if you want some deeper analysis about some of these teams, I do have some other videos on this channel that you might want to look at. I'll link some of them down below, but otherwise just kind of surf around the channel. I'm sure you'll find something you like. If you did enjoy this video, please subscribe for more content. Again, I will have a part 2 video coming out for the other quarterfinals matchups. I'm sure I'll do more with this major as well. So definitely stay tuned. Catch you next time.